Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here today. It's really deeply moving to see so many friends and colleagues gathered together. What I would like to do is talk about three things. First, I want to provide my perspective on what's changed over the last 25 years that I've been observing forests in Indonesia. Second, I want to give some reflections specifically on CIFOR as it approaches its 20th anniversary next year. And third, I just want to throw out a few thoughts on current events, challenges, opportunities, especially with respect to Indonesia's emerging leadership in the role of forests and climate change. Now, 25 years ago, in 1987, I was pretty fresh out of graduate school, and I got my dream job to come to Indonesia and work on forestry issues. Now remember, the late 80s was the last time around when the international community discovered tropical forests. And everybody was very excited about new words like biodiversity. It was before the first Rio summit, so even before the original Rio. It was before CIFOR was even existing, maybe baru a gleam in somebody's eye. It was before reformasi here in Indonesia. And it was even before cell phones and email. Bayangin, how did we survive? Now, my job at the Ford Foundation in Jakarta, where I followed in big footsteps of people like Sidney Jones, smile and wave, Sidney, was to nurture a group of grantees associated with what was called social forestry, that Pak Iman has already mentioned. And I was also responsible for the modest portfolio of human rights grant making that was possible under the Suharto regime at that time. And it was a wonderful job. I mean, I got to meet all kinds of interesting people who were working for progressive change, and many of them are still, with us here today. Ota Santosa, Ismir Haddad, Bungaran Saragi, William Sunderland was a grantee at that time. And I even had the prescience to ask Wimar Witolar to do an evaluation of the social forestry program before he became famous. So I knew him when. Now, I realize how tiresome now it must have been, or it must continue to be, for those of you here in Indonesia, to welcome wave after wave of young foreigners with bright ideas about what needs to change and zero appreciation of why things are the way they are. And I was certainly one of those clueless young foreigners, and I am deeply grateful to those of you who were patient with me and have contributed to my education. I'm still clueless, but no longer young. Now, they say that when you're climbing a mountain, you sometimes need to pause and look down to see how far you've ascended, because otherwise you only look up and see how far the summit still is away and you get discouraged. So I want to pause and look down for a minute so that we can all feel how far we've come. Now, I think foreigners often who come here for postings of 2, 3, 4 years, they don't get the opportunity to experience the profound changes that unfold over a longer time frame. And for me, I feel incredibly lucky that my 2 stints here in Indonesia, spanning 25 years and including sort of the 2 big pulses of interest in international forestry, has given me a chance to connect the dots between the ideas, the individuals, and the institutions, that have progressed over that time span. And that progress gives me a lot of hope for the future. Now, it's hard to imagine now, but 25 years ago, you really could not talk about indigenous people's rights and forest land. You really couldn't. But now, it is openly discussed in the context of a task force on forest tenure reform in the Ministry of Forestry, led by Pak Hadi Pasaribu. I mean, that's pretty amazing. 25 years ago, the World Bank was attacked by people like me, for advocacy groups for financing deforestation and violating indigenous people's rights through transmigration and large dams. And now the World Bank and other MDBs are working with Aman and similar indigenous groups here and in other countries to work on capacity development related to the registration of ancestral domain claims. And it's amazing. 20 years ago, the proposal to share timber revenues with local communities was a complete non-starter at Perumperutani, the State Forest Corporation, because it challenged the idea of kawasan hutan as being the exclusive purview of the state. But when I came back to Indonesia 6 years ago, there was indeed a program of sharing timber revenues with local communities in Java. Even 10 years ago, the field of forest governance was still quite new, and it was novel to be able to even talk about the existence of illegal logging and forest-related corruption. And it was only just over 10 years ago that the first ministerial meeting on forest law enforcement and governance was hosted by the government of Indonesia in Bali in September 2001. Then in 2002, Indonesia helped launch the Asia Forest Partnership at Rio+10, so another milestone, and created a much-needed multi-stakeholder forum to provide a safe place to talk about the sensitive issues of illegal logging. But as we recently discussed at the Ministry of Forestry, we actually now have a problem of too many forums to discuss illegal logging, and so the Asia Forest Partnership is gonna step back. Indonesia is also now the first country to negotiate a voluntary partnership agreement with the European Commission to make sure that its timber exports are legal. And with the help of people like Andy Roby, who's here today, Indonesia is in the process of implementing a timber legality assurance system to assure compliance. Now, putting such a system in place that's effective will be like climbing a mountain in its own right, and I don't want to be understood to say that any of this is easy in doing this or all the other many things I've mentioned. But when I look down from the mountain, I get dizzy seeing how far we've climbed. Now let me say a few words about CIFOR and about forestry research. Let me take a minute to recognize the CIFOR staff who are here with me today, because we have many of our most senior scientists working on Indonesia. Could you just raise your hand so people know who you are? Yeah, alumni juga boleh. Raise your hand. Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. And let me also take the opportunity to introduce CIFOR's new Deputy Director General, Peter Kanalski, who joined us last month, coming to us from Australia. Center for International Forestry Research was established in 1993. So I like to say this is our last year as a teenager. We're going to have to start behaving after this. 2 decades ago, the government of Indonesia mounted a vigorous campaign to have the privilege of hosting CIFOR's headquarters. And if I'm not mistaken, CIFOR remains the only global-scale international organization with its headquarters here in Indonesia. And several of CIFOR's founding fathers are here with us today. We have Pak Jamaluddin, who, as Minister of Forestry at that time, presided over the early years of CIFOR's establishment and is responsible for the beautiful campus that we inhabit west of Bogor. And for those of you who haven't managed to visit yet, and I'm looking at you, Ambassador Suarez, we welcome you to come make a visit to our campus. I also want to recognize Pak Kuswata Kartawinata, who was the person who guided CIFOR's early research in East Kalimantan in the Malinau district. Now, CIFOR works throughout the tropics, both humid forests, dry forests, and we have offices and staff members in 9 other countries around the world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But Indonesia has always occupied a disproportionate share of our research agenda, because Indonesia's forests provide an ideal laboratory for studying all the reasons that forests are valuable, as well as all the reasons that they're disappearing. A global CIFOR research project recently showed that on average, forest products that are used for consumption or sale make up about 24% of the incomes of rural households in and around forests. 24%, and that's more than comes from agricultural crops. And I'm sure it's a lot more than that in many places in Indonesia. CIFOR researchers working with communities in Malinau and East Kalimantan identified more than 3,600 specific uses for more than 1,400 forest species, suggesting a very high degree of dependence of rural livelihoods on forest biodiversity. Forest industry can also be a locally important source of employment. The small-scale teak and mahogany furniture industry in Jepara constitutes more than 1/4 of the income of the economy of that district. And interestingly, a recent study conducted in collaboration with Harry Pernomo, who's here somewhere, where are you, Harry, on the value chains related to that small-scale furniture shows that when the international market for those furniture products contracts, it's the women who get laid off first. So we always got to remember to pay attention to the gender dimensions of forest benefits. More recently, as we all know, forests are being valued for their role in storing carbon. And CIFOR has made a specialty of studying the carbon that's stored in wetland forest ecosystems, in particular here in Indonesia, the peatlands and the mangroves. And among our findings are that previous methods for estimating emissions that result when you convert peatlands to other uses may be inaccurate, and we're working to improve those estimates with better methods and better data. We've also found that mangrove forests have a lot more carbon below the surface than was previously thought, and suggesting that the destruction of mangroves is probably a globally significant source of emissions that cause climate change. I'm sort of looking at Daniel Murtiarso. Am I getting this right? Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, but while we're doing research about the global importance of Indonesia's forests as a source of emissions, we're also pursuing a number of lines of research to demonstrate the local and national development benefits of forests here in Indonesia that we think are not yet sufficiently appreciated. And one of those is a use of forests as a source of resilience to climate change. We tend to focus on forests and mitigation, but actually forests and adaptation is at least as important. In Indonesia, climate change is predicted to bring about an increase in the frequency and severity of intensive rainfall events and the flooding and the landslides that come along with those events. Keeping the forests intact is a way to mitigate that damage. Similarly, climate change is expected to bring longer, hotter, drier, dry seasons, and keeping forests intact is a good way to manage the risks of wildfires that come along with those changes. But another contribution that's been big on the international agenda lately is the issue of food security. And some people here in Indonesia and elsewhere would have you believe that Indonesia has to choose between forests on the one hand or food on the other hand. But in fact, converting forests to agriculture can actually be detrimental to agricultural sustainable productivity because forests provide so many environmental services to agriculture in the form of pollination services, in the form of hydrological services. Bungaran is nodding, good. So we need to increase the visibility of those forests, local forest benefits. But despite all these benefits, as we all know, Indonesia's forests continue to disappear. Starting in the mid-90s, CIFOR started what turned out to be a decade's worth of research on the underlying causes of deforestation, including here in Indonesia, but also globally. And CIFOR has done studies on the role of agricultural expansion, of the pulp and paper industry, of infrastructure development, of fire, of decentralization, of illegal logging, and of inappropriate law enforcement approaches. But the bottom line is, it still remains more profitable to destroy a forest than to conserve it. And second, the governance tools that are necessary to achieve more optimal land use outcomes remain either weak or incomplete. I think we're all aware now it's the governance stupid, as paraphrasing the election campaign in the US, it's the economy stupid. Indonesia needs more certain land tenure, more inclusive processes for spatial planning, more accountable and transparent processes for granting permits, whether to exploit forests, to convert forests to other uses, or indeed to conserve forests. Now, not surprisingly, doing research on these topics has sometimes gotten CIFOR into hot water. And it is no secret that CIFOR's relationship with its host country has not always been smooth or comfortable. And in fact, I think that some of those officials who campaigned to have CIFOR's headquarters located in Indonesia probably later concluded that they should have been careful what they wished for. Now, from the beginning, CIFOR's board has steered the organization towards policy-oriented research, not just in the fields or in the laboratories. And that has meant undertaking research on sensitive topics, such as overcapacity in the pulp and paper sector, or illegal logging, or corruption, just to name a few. And not surprisingly, some of our colleagues in the Ministry of Forestry or certain segments of the private sector have not always been happy with either the content or even the tone of CIFOR's publications. In fact, I recall a conversation with Ibu Nuning in Tokyo a few years ago where a concept note floating around had caused consternation at the Indonesian embassy in Tokyo. And we had to deal with that particular sensitivity. Actually, yeah, Hadi was on the other side of the SMS, as I recall, yeah, from that incident. And Ibu Nuning has actually just returned to Indonesia to take up a new position as Director of International Cooperation at the Ministry. So we'll look forward to your further guidance, Ibu Nuning, how we can stay on the right side of things. But anyway, in order to deal with those sensitivities, over the last few years, we have put into place a so-called no surprises policy. so that when we're publishing on a sensitive topic, we share the manuscript with the ministry officials at the time of external review, so that if there are concerns, at least we know about them before we go to publication rather than after. And that has actually worked extremely well. And for me, I think it speaks extraordinarily well of the Indonesian government and of the Ministry of Forestry in particular, that the ministry has not only tolerated, but in many cases welcomed critical analysis from CIFOR on issues such as what lessons can we learn from the dana reboisasi mismanagement to make sure we don't repeat them in the context of red revenues, and the analysis that we completed on the moratorium last year, for which this week is the first anniversary. So I think both sides, the CIFOR and the Ministry of Forestry, have worked hard to get over the sakit hati that may have developed over previous events, and to build trust through more regular information sharing and doing joint projects such as the joint Bahasa language website on RED in Indonesia that we currently are cooperating on. We've also attempted to reach out to the private sector, for example, through events at the Business for Environment Conference this time last year here in Jakarta, as well as the Forest Indonesia Conference that we sponsored last September. I'm really happy to see Nana Suparna here today, because the first timber concession I ever visited was one of his companies on the border between West and Central Kalimantan. So Pak Nana, thank you very much for welcoming the clueless young foreigner with bright ideas to your timber concession. Finally, CIFOR has been incredibly fortunate to have a series of Ministry of Forestry secondees to our staff to serve as liaison officers. Efrancia, who could not be here today, and August Joko Esmanto, who has been here, and they're the ones who've had to manage this delicate relationship and have done a very good job. But also, we've been extremely fortunate, as Pak Iman suggested, in having the best and the brightest of the ministry serve on our board of trustees. And so that has included Pak Hadi Pasaribu, Pak Wayudi Wardoyo, Tahir Fatoni, who couldn't be here today, and now Pak Iman Santoso. So Pak Iman, as my newest boss, will be joining the CIFOR board meeting next week and participating in the selection of the next Director General of CIFOR. There will be 3 candidates interviewed next week. And I'm sure that next year, on the occasion of CIFOR's 20th anniversary, it's going to be a great opportunity to celebrate the many ways that CIFOR and Indonesia have developed a mutually beneficial relationship and reaffirm our commitment to cultivating that relationship. Let me now turn my attention to the present moment and the historic opportunity that I think Indonesia currently faces to transform the future of its forests, and in particular in the context of climate change. Remember that it was only 5 years ago that forests got back on the international agenda after an absence of 10 to 15 years. And it was because of this new appreciation that emissions from deforestation were greater in terms of total emissions than all of the transport sectors globally combined. And Indonesia was in the spotlight as the 3rd largest area of tropical forests after the Brazilian, the Amazonian, and Congo basins. But even more so, Indonesia was a disproportionate source of global emissions compared to its land area or population because of the carbon richness of its ecosystems and the rate at which they were being lost. Many of you now know Indonesia is home to 50% of the world's tropical peatlands. And peatlands have a much higher density of carbon socked away than do regular forests, in some places up to 15 meters deep. Think about that number, 15 meters deep carbon stored away. And as I mentioned before, we now know that mangrove destruction is an important source of emissions, and Indonesia, with its extensive coastlines, is abundantly endowed with those wonderful ecosystems. But with the conversion of those ecosystems, carbon was being released into the atmosphere at a rapid pace with the clearing, with the draining, with the burning. And now Indonesia has lost 50% of its mangroves in the last 40 years, is that right, Daniel? And is still continuing at the rate of 80,000 hectares per year. And I am told that the big forest fires that Indonesia experienced in 1997 released an amount of carbon equivalent to the annual global total from all sources the previous year. So that's why it's clear that the world community cannot meet its target of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius unless the forests of Indonesia are part of the solution. You do the math, and it can't be done. So as Wimar Witolar famously put it, Indonesia has the chance to be a global forest superpower because the world can't do it without Indonesia. So that's why the world so welcomed Indonesia's hosting of the UNFCCC's COP13 in Bali in 2007 and all of the preparations that went in domestically to develop a strategy for Indonesia to deal with forests and climate change. And to me, I think it was fully appropriate that it was Indonesia that attended to the birth of what we now know as REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, that I would date really having its launch to that COP13 in Bali. The next 2 years later, in 2009, was when President Yudhoyono made his personal commitment to this agenda with his announcement of emissions reductions targets that was the first of any developing country leader to do so. And then in 2010, the governments of Indonesia and Norway signed off on the now famous letter of intent on REDD. And I would argue that that LOI was significant in a number of ways. First of all, it showed an admirable willingness on the part of both governments to take a risk. Everybody knew that the targets in the LOI were going to be incredibly difficult to achieve. But senior officials on both sides of that negotiation took a decision that the risks of no action were greater than the risks of taking action and risking failure. So, Ambassador Homa and representatives in the Indonesian government, I salute you for being willing to take that risk. Second, the LOI caused what I would call a tectonic shift in the discussions in the future of Indonesia's forests. Something about putting $1 billion on the table gets everybody's attention. And having observed Indonesia's forestry sector for now 25 years, the only other moment that comes close to that tectonic shift in my memory was in the context of another letter of intent. And that was the one between the IMF and the government of Indonesia at the time of the financial crisis. And few people recall, but that LOI also had a paragraph on forestry reform and included a moratorium on conversion for oil palm plantations. But note the critical difference in framing. Remember the iconic image of the IMF LOI with Mr. Kamdasu standing behind President Suharto as he signed the letter of intent? The iconic image from the Norwegian government of Indonesia LOI was of two heads of state standing beside their national flags, watching their ministers sign the documents. So we've gone, and I think this encapsulates a big change in international forestry cooperation from a donor-recipient relationship to a relationship of equal partners. And I think that's really important. Third, and perhaps not least for us, the LOI provided a great opportunity for CIFOR to demonstrate our value to our host country. Because here we were sitting on a decade of research on the underlying causes of deforestation. So suddenly we had both parties to the negotiation coming to us asking for data and advice. It was great. And thanks to the donor governments represented here today, including not least the governments of Norway and Australia, CIFOR has had the resources to launch a really ambitious global comparative study on the first generation of REDD initiatives around the world, but not least here in Indonesia. And we will be launching a book next month in Rio on the preliminary findings from that research. So we're grateful for that support. And indeed, thanks to the now increased demand for the knowledge that CIFOR generates, we have a problem of maintaining a critical distance from all of this activity as independent researchers. You know, what am I going to say when I get a formal letter from the Office of the President asking us to loan them Daniel Murtiarso to help with the National REDD Strategy? Yeah, Pak Heru, I'm looking at you. You know, it's like, it's a problem, but it's a good problem to have. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, Pak Daniel is quoted in today's Asian Wall Street Journal in an article about the first anniversary of the moratorium. So we got a celebrity among us. Bottom line, I see an alignment of a diverse set of constituencies around a new vision for the future of Indonesia's forests. We've got officials in the Ministry of Forestry who accept the idea that management of forests can be done in collaboration with local communities. We've got a whole of government commitment through the RED Task Force to the transparency of forest-related data. You know, it's in the news this week, you know, the map, that has been made possible through the implementation of the moratorium. We've got a wide coalition of civil society groups who are committed to this agenda, not least because there are many concerned about forest tenure reform from a rights-based perspective. We've got economic planners who understand the costs of forest mismanagement. We've got private sector companies who see an upside benefit to going green and going legal. And not least, we have a president who has committed the remainder of his tenure to this agenda, and B, an international community with stakes in climate protection that is eager to help. And as Andrew Steer said at the Forest Indonesia conference last September, the international community is desperate for Indonesia to succeed, and we're all on the edge of our seats wishing all the best in that success. So, concluding thoughts. The jury is still out in terms of what's going to happen to Indonesia's forests, what's going to happen to the local communities that depend on those forests, and what's going to happen to the global community that depend on those forests for climate stability. And sometimes it's easy to find reasons to be discouraged about what's going to happen. I'll confess that on a recent visit to Riau, I was overwhelmed by the scale and the pace of forest conversion. I mean, literally driving for hours and seeing recent conversion, kiri kanan, on either side of the road. And it seems that the strength and the variety of pressures for converting forests to other uses is overwhelming the capacities of government agencies, civil society groups to address those pressures. And I also think we're concerned that the progress that has been made is associated with a few key individuals, not least the president himself, and a concern that unless recent commitments are more institutionalized, they could be lost in the context of elections in the coming years. But on other days, I'm encouraged by the growing strength of the ideas, the individuals, and the institutions that are coming together to change the way Indonesia's forests are managed. And let me just give you one inspiring example. More than 25 years ago, a group of people came together around the Ministry of Forestry, supported by a group of colleagues from NGOs and from the academic community, and began to develop this idea of social forestry, perhutanan sosial, here in Indonesia. And in particular, what it might look like in the uplands of Java. And at that time, Perum Perhutani, the State Forest Corporation, was managing the colonial heritage of teak plantations with a main goal of timber revenue generation and with a heavy-handed armed guards law enforcement approach. And frankly, it seemed hopelessly naive to imagine reorienting such an organization to a more collaborative approach, working with farmers to manage the forest and share the benefits. But a number of individuals were introduced to these ideas through training, through study tours, through scholarships to study abroad, learning from other countries and learning from each other. And over the years, these individuals have gradually moved into leadership roles, both within the government and within civil society and academia. And last year, one of those individuals, who was associated with the program 25 years ago, was appointed Director Utama of Perum Perhutani. And now, he's developing a new vision for the organization, focused on forests not as a source of timber revenue to be policed, but as a generator of rural livelihoods and ecosystem services. You can now buy Perum Perhutani branded water. You know, what a change. So it's a wonderful example of how investments in those ideas, individuals, and institutions can pay off in the long run. 25 years ago, the powerful idea was social forestry, and we're still harvesting the fruits of the seeds that were planted then. Now, the idea of RED has catalyzed a flourishing debate about the future and funds and political will that are shaking up forestry in Indonesia and globally. It was study tours to Indonesia that introduced Perum Perhutani officials to the idea of sharing timber revenues. And I suspect that study tours to Brazil and to other countries to promote the South-South sharing of ideas will be important to the development of RED in Indonesia and elsewhere. But individuals are ultimately the agents of change. And I encourage all of you in a position to do so to invest in the capacity of individuals. I'm looking at Agus Joko Ismanto, who was sent to the Philippines to study, 20 years ago, Agus, and came back with an idea of the forester as an agent of change. And I look out and I think of all of the people in whom the international community, others have invested, and the returns to Indonesia that that has generated. Institutions. One of the most important things going on in Indonesia right now is the building of the new institutional capacity for better forest governance across government agencies, civil society, and the private sector. And certainly one of the huge mountains we all have to climb is building that capacity, not just here in Jakarta, but in the provinces, at the kabupaten levels, at community levels. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to redirect development pressures to areas that are already deforested as opposed to areas where there are still intact forests. But a particular area for further investment that's obvious to me from the perch of CIFOR is in policy research capacity. And frankly, it pains me when international consulting firms or international NGOs, or even CIFOR for that matter, is given support to do things that should be done by national organizations, or to do things without a mandate to create the capacity here in Indonesia to do what should be done by domestic, legitimate political actors. And I think I can safely predict that building that capacity will remain a priority for CIFOR in the future, and we look forward to working together with our colleagues to achieve it in the coming years. Next month, I will be heading to Brazil for the Rio +20 events there, and then coming back to Bogor to pack up with my husband Mike and move back to the United States in early July. And in case I don't have the opportunity to see you before that time, let me take the chance now to apologize for the many shortcomings and mistakes that I've made during my tenure here, but also to thank all of you for all the things that you've done for me that have made my time in Indonesia such a wonderful experience. Thank you.